But first, China's rise. How did it happen? Why did China rise? Starting point for me are two critical decisions made in 1977, 78. This is an analytic construct, not I can date exactly when the decisions were made. But in China, it's the decision after the death of Mao Zedong that the strategy of development that had been pursued by China for 3 decades had been a disaster. Objectively, it had been. China was falling further behind the countries to which it compared itself, which it considered a security challenge, that the frequent shifts in domestic policy, in foreign policy, the pursuit of a unique Chinese road to development had failed. That on most dimensions, China was not a whole lot better in the late 1970s than it had been in 1949 after decades of war and civil war. So the decision to abandon experimentation and a search for a unique road to development and follow the path that had proven successful for some of China's neighbors, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. No more experimentation. Do what works. What worked in this analysis was export-led growth through integration into the global economic system, the free world economic system. This is still during the Cold War, 2 camps here. A system dominated by the United States. The United States was the key. China's entry into the system, ability to participate, depended on U.S. decision to allow that to happen. And that's the second important decision, the Carter administration. By 1978, recognized that Deng Xiaoping and those around him were looking for a viable alternative to the failed policies of previous decades. The decision was made not to attempt to thwart that strategy, but to assist that strategy. It was an extrapolation or a continuation of the realpolitik logic that led Nixon to go to Beijing. Enemy of my enemy is my friend. Anti-Soviet alignment. By 1978, the U.S. view in the Carter administration was, if China is going to be a partner in a Cold War expected to last forever for practical purpose, it was far better to have a partner that was strong than a partner that was a liability. So the decision made in the Carter administration to respond positively and indeed to encourage the Chinese decisions by saying, in effect, not only will we not oppose you, we will help you. China is the first, and during the Cold War, the only sort of country admitted to the free world club without having to change its political system, without having to change much at all beyond its economic policy. It got special dispensation to be in what was then the free world system. China regarded this as an opportunity to be seized. It was desperate to have a more effective developmental strategy after decades of failure. It was in a very vulnerable position, so it wanted to take advantage of this and get with the program as quickly as possible. Before the window of opportunity closed, before the perfidious Americans changed their mind, before the rest of the world figured out what China was doing. So rush, do this fast. That becomes important because on one critical issue after another, where one could imagine Chinese hesitancy to push ahead with reform, to make the changes required to take full advantage of participation in the economic order, the free world order, the Chinese made the decisions. They made the right decisions to keep engagement moving forward. It was a fortuitous time for China to join the international community. You think back to 78, or read back to 78 for you, 79, the world was awash in money. That it was a good time in terms of globalization moving to a different level. Communications networks that made it possible to have a wholly different kind of multinational production supply chain. China came along at the right time. But it needed the U.S. not just acquiescence. Chinese judgment, articulated by Deng Xiaoping, for this strategy to exceed must be a peaceful international order, it must be a peaceful regional neighborhood. Global order depended heavily at the time on the United States, the counterbalance to the Soviet Union. The role of the U.S. as a balancer, as a peacekeeper, as a maintenance, as the maintainer of the portion of the global system into which China wished to enter was important. That meant, at a minimum, you had to maintain reasonably good relations with the United States. But also meant for China, it didn't have to invest a lot urgently in its own defense. As with everything else in China, there's a rationale and a rhetoric and slogans that explain things. It's a shift from the Maoist view that war with the imperialists was inevitable and imminent. It could happen at any time. So the mode of development, the mode of military buildup was predicated on assumption that war could happen and was likely to happen soon. Deng articulated the different strategy, a different perception of the world. War with the imperialists is still inevitable, but it is not imminent. Indeed, it can be delayed for 20 years. That 20 years started in 1978, but it's a rolling 20. Today, it's still 20 years away. That opened a window of opportunity for China to develop its strength. It meant it didn't have to dump resources into military acquisition. It didn't have to attempt military modernization while it was trying to lay the fundamentals for a modern economy, rebuilding education, rebuilding the transportation system, improving economic capacity, acquiring industrial technologies. The military moved to the end of what were called the four modernizations: agriculture, industry, science, and technology, and the military. It stayed there until about 2.5 decades ago. The mode of modernization and development that China adopted was predicated on taking full advantage of the system as quickly as possible. That meant acceding to the demands of the system without a lot of jockeying around. There was rhetoric about how China was joining the international system, and this was a joint venture. This was a merger. The de facto answer from the system was, no, you're joining an existing club. Welcome to join, but we ain't changing. You want to join, you play by the existing rules. You accept the norms of this system. And after a couple of years of, well, we ought to talk about this because we're big, we're different. And the system said, we don't care. This works. It's important then it worked because you got the Soviet Union up there. We're not screwing around with this. Come in under the terms that we want, and that's what China did. And it worked for China. That development started slowly, but by the late 80s was beginning to be visible, beginning to have real effects. A little bit of a digression before leaving, and that's restoration of legitimacy for the Communist Party was a critical objective after the death of Mao. Policy vacillations, bad policy, brutal policies at times, had dramatically eroded the legitimacy of party leadership. In the late 70s, it gets based on performance. The party is entitled to rule because it's delivering the fruits, the benefits of modernization, of development. That became the principal pillar. Still is the principal pillar. The secondary pillar was nationalism. Part of the national mythology of having liberated China from Japanese rule and repression, mythology about the role of the party in the Civil War and so forth. Defense of China's territorial integrity, China's sovereignty, ending the century of humiliation. Well, it became an important part of legitimacy. I'll come back to that because this nationalist pillar has become increasingly important. So China, by the turn of the century, is clearly a successful late modernizer. It's been very successful. One of the reasons it's been successful is policy continuity. Through changes of leaders, the decision to build a structure that made it hard for any individual leader to run away with the system the way Mao had, that made it hard to change the fundamental directions of policy. Stick with it. When things are going badly, like after Tiananmen in 1989, stick with it when things are going well because it works. It's structurally very hard to change except to make the marginal adjustments within the broad strategy.